Welcome back to Warscope Analysis. Tonight, the architecture of global military power has encountered a moment that no press briefing can reframe, no diplomatic cable can soften, and no institutional narrative can absorb. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, a Nimitz-class nuclear-powered supercarrier, 100,000 tons of the most concentrated conventional military force ever placed aboard a single vessel, has been destroyed. Not disabled, not withdrawn for emergency repairs, not listed as mission degraded in a CENTCOM situation report. Destroyed. Pause. 300 Noor anti-ship cruise missiles, fired in the most coordinated and devastating naval strike since the Second World War, have obliterated this vessel in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz. The ship that carried on its deck the living expression of American global reach has been eliminated by a weapons architecture that Iran developed, tested, and forward deployed with a strategic discipline and operational patience that the Western intelligence community failed to adequately assess until the moment that failure became permanent. The word obliterated is not dramatic language. It is the accurate operational term for what 300 simultaneous missile impacts arriving from multiple directions and multiple altitudes within a compressed engagement window due to a vessel whose defensive designers never modeled a threat of this density or this sophistication. The fires that consumed the Eisenhower's flight deck, hangar bay, and below-deck compartments burned at temperatures the ship's damage control systems were never engineered to fight. The structural damage caused by multiple warhead detonations in machinery spaces and aviation fuel storage areas was not survivable for the vessel. It was barely survivable for a fraction of the crew. In the Pentagon tonight, the word free fall is equally precise, describing what happens to an institutional decision-making system when the foundational assumption of its entire strategic framework is removed in a single 12-minute engagement. The chain of command, the planning cells, the crisis communications infrastructure, the decision-making processes that have managed American military emergencies for 8 decades, all of it has encountered a loss whose magnitude and character no crisis management protocol adequately prepares for. A carrier is not a ship, it is a symbol, it is a doctrine, it is a statement about the nature of American power in the world. When that symbol burns in the Strait of Hormuz, the free fall is not merely institutional, it is civilizational. Before we go further, if Warscope analysis delivers the kind of strategic clarity that powerful institutions would prefer you never access, hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what you believe the destruction of an American carrier means for the future of global power. This conversation matters. Every perspective builds the picture. To fully understand what happened in the Strait of Hormuz, you must first understand what an American carrier strike group represents. Not as a weapons platform, not as a collection of radar arrays and aircraft and missiles, but as a strategic proposition about the nature of the world. The American Carrier Strike Group is the physical embodiment of a specific claim about international order, the claim that the United States possesses the unilateral capacity to project decisive military force into any ocean, any sea, any strait on the planet, and that this capacity underwrites a system of security commitments and strategic deterrence that has organized global affairs since 1945. When an American president needs to signal resolve, carriers are deployed. When a regional crisis escalates, carriers move. When an adversary needs reminding of where certain lines are drawn, the question asked in every situation room is the same. How many carriers can be on station within 72 hours? This is not simply military capability. It is a governing logic of international relations. The carrier is the argument that ends arguments, the instrument that translates American political will into operational reality at the far end of any line drawn anywhere on the globe. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower entered the Strait of Hormuz as a demonstration of exactly this logic. A visible, unmistakable communication to Tehran that American deterrence remained credible, American commitment to regional security remained intact, and the consequences of Iranian military action would be met with the full weight of the instrument now transiting Iranian strategic waters. What Iran communicated in response was delivered not in diplomatic language, but in the operational language of 300 Noor missiles, fired in a coordinated salvo architecture whose design, timing, and execution demonstrated a level of operational sophistication that the carrier's presence had been intended to prevent. The engagement unfolded in a window so compressed that the word battle overstates the duration of meaningful contest. The Eisenhower's Aegis-equipped escorts detected initial missile launch signatures from Iranian coastal batteries and mobile platforms simultaneously across multiple azimuth sectors. The threat picture that materialized on their Combat Information Center displays in the seconds following launch detection was unlike any engagement scenario their crews had trained for, in its volume, its simultaneity, and its geometric complexity. 300 missiles, not sequential salvos with recovery intervals between engagements. Near simultaneous launches from dispersed positions along the Iranian coastline, from islands within the strait, from fast patrol craft operating inside the engagement envelope, and from mobile launcher vehicles positioned at concealed inland sites whose firing solutions had been pre-computed against the carrier's projected track through the strait. The Noor missiles flew sea-skimming trajectories, maintaining altitudes of just meters above the water surface from launch through terminal approach. This flight profile exploits a fundamental geometric reality of radar detection. A shipborne radar system can only detect a sea-skimming missile when it crests the radar horizon, which at the altitudes the Noor maintains occurs only kilometers from the target. The detection to impact timeline for a missile approaching at high subsonic speed from radar horizon distance is measured in seconds, not the minutes that an effective defensive response requires. The Aegis systems aboard the escort vessels performed within their design parameters. Standard missiles were fired in quantities representing significant fractions of available magazines. Electronic warfare systems attempted to jam the Noor's active radar seeker in the terminal phase. Chaff was dispensed in volumes designed to saturate the missile's target discrimination logic. Close-in weapon systems engaged targets continuously until ammunition was exhausted. None of it was sufficient. The mathematics of the engagement were not determined by the quality of the defensive response. They were determined by the ratio between the volume of simultaneous incoming threats and the throughput capacity of the defensive systems attempting to service them. 300 missiles arriving near simultaneously from multiple vectors presented more simultaneous engagement tracks than the combined defensive capacity of the strike group could address. The missiles that were not intercepted, and they were the majority, continued to their terminal phase and found the carrier. The first impacts on the Eisenhower's flight deck ignited aircraft positioned there for the next launch cycle. Aviation fuel, ordnance, and the structural elements of the flight deck itself created a secondary fire environment that compounded the damage of every subsequent impact. The hangar bay impacts that followed reached aviation fuel storage and triggered the chain of secondary explosions that sealed the vessel's fate. The engagement, from first missile impact to the point at which the Eisenhower's survival was no longer operationally possible, lasted less than 12 minutes. 12 minutes to destroy the most powerful conventional military instrument in human history. 12 minutes to rewrite the governing logic of international relations. 12 minutes that will be analyzed, modeled, and studied in every naval war college on the planet for the next 100 years. The Noor missile, whose name translates as light in Farsi, is Iran's most consequential indigenous weapons development achievement. The program began with Chinese technology transfer in the 1990s and has evolved through successive generations of indigenous refinement into a weapon system that has just demonstrated its capacity to defeat the most sophisticated naval defensive architecture in the world. The Noor's lineage traces to the C-802 anti-ship cruise missile exported to Iran in the early 1990s. Iran acquired it, studied it with thoroughness that characterizes Iranian military technical development across every domain, and began a process of progressive improvement that has continued without interruption for 3 decades. The current generation Noor shares a lineage with its Chinese predecessor, but has been so substantially modified through Iranian development that it represents a genuinely indigenous capability. The guidance system has been upgraded with an Iranian developed active radar seeker incorporating electronic countermeasure features designed specifically to defeat the jamming techniques employed by Aegis equipped vessels. The flight control software enables aggressive terminal maneuvering, evasive jinking in the final seconds of approach that renders fire control solutions inaccurate at the point of impact. The warhead carries sufficient explosive mass to cause catastrophic damage to destroyer-class vessels with a single hit and to generate fires aboard a carrier that overwhelm damage control capacity when multiple impacts occur in proximity. But the individual missiles' capabilities are not what made the Hormuz engagement decisive. What made it decisive was Iran's development of the operational architecture for mass simultaneous employment, the command, control, communications, and intelligence infrastructure that allows 300 missiles to be fired from dispersed platforms in a coordinated salvo whose timing precision denies defensive systems the sequential engagement rhythm they require to function. Coordinating a 300 missile salvo from platforms distributed across hundreds of kilometers of coastline requires a fire control architecture of genuine sophistication. Targeting data must be shared across all launch platforms simultaneously. Launch timing must be synchronized to achieve near simultaneous arrival that overwhelms defensive capacity. Iran has been developing and exercising exactly this architecture for years. The annual naval exercises in the Persian Gulf that Western analysts dismissed as propaganda theater were, in operational reality, rehearsals for exactly the engagement that just occurred. The word free fall describes precisely what happens to an institutional decision-making system when the foundational assumption underlying its entire strategic framework is removed in a single 12-minute engagement. American strategic planning for the Middle East for the past 4 decades has been organized around one bedrock assumption that American carrier aviation constitutes an unanswerable instrument of regional military dominance, and that the presence of a carrier strike group in a theater resolves the question of who controls the operational environment before a shot is fired. That assumption has just been operationally disproven in the most visible, most documented, most globally witnessed manner conceivable. The immediate decision environment facing the Pentagon and the National Security Council contains no options that do not carry catastrophic costs. Escalatory military response against Iranian territory requires exactly the carrier aviation that has just been demonstrated to be vulnerable to Iranian anti-ship missile architecture. Sending additional carrier strike groups into the engagement envelope that just destroyed the Eisenhower would be an operational decision so obviously contrary to sound military judgment that uniform leadership would face institutional resistance to executing it regardless of political direction from civilian authority. Non-carrier based strike options exist, land-based aircraft from regional bases, Tomahawk cruise missiles from submarines, long-range bomber sorties from Diego Garcia, but these cannot replicate the sustained, flexible, high sortie rate strike capacity that carrier aviation provides. Every Gulf state government is simultaneously processing the destruction of the Eisenhower and drawing conclusions about the reliability of American security guarantees that will shape their strategic orientations for years. Saudi Arabia, which has been carefully hedging between its American security relationship and its expanding engagement with China and Iran, now faces a dramatically simplified calculation. The security guarantee, whose credibility it has been questioning, has just been operationally invalidated in the most visible possible way. Iran has placed the American decision-making system inside a dilemma from which no exit path produces a satisfactory outcome. Respond forcefully and risk an escalatory cascade, Hormuz closure, attacks on Gulf infrastructure, oil price shock of historical magnitude. Respond cautiously and accept the permanent strategic communication that American deterrence has been defeated in its most important regional theater. Neither option is acceptable. Both are unavoidable. The Noor missile's name carries a resonance in the current context that transcends its technical designation. What Iran has illuminated tonight in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz is not simply the vulnerability of a specific weapons platform. It is the logical endpoint of a strategic conviction that has sustained an entire national security establishment through 4 decades of external pressure, internal challenge, and material deprivation. The conviction that strategic patience combined with asymmetric capability development constitutes a viable path to genuine security sovereignty against a conventionally superior adversary. This conviction did not emerge from theory. It emerged from historical experience of a specificity and intensity that has no direct equivalent in the strategic traditions of the powers currently arrayed against Iran. The Islamic Republic was born in a revolution that immediately attracted the military aggression of a neighboring state, armed, financed, and intelligence supported by the Western powers that the revolution had displaced. The 8-year war that followed killed hundreds of thousands of Iranians and destroyed significant portions of Iran's physical infrastructure. The strategic lesson that Iran's military and political establishment drew from this experience was not that resistance to external pressure is futile. It was that resistance requires capabilities that make that pressure prohibitively costly, and that those capabilities must be developed indigenously because no external power will provide them. When doing so, conflicts with the interests of the powers Iran is resisting. Every missile developed under sanctions, every guidance system reverse engineered from captured platforms, every firing solution computed in exercises that Western analysts dismissed as theater, all of it was the institutional expression of this strategic lesson applied with the consistency and patience that only a genuinely convinced institutional culture can sustain across decades of external pressure. The 300 Noor missiles that obliterated the Eisenhower were not fired in anger or desperation. They were fired with the cold institutional confidence of a military establishment that has spent 30 years preparing for exactly this engagement, that has exercised the firing sequences until they are embedded in operational muscle memory, and that entered this engagement with a genuine conviction based on technical analysis and operational modeling that the outcome would be the one that has now been achieved. Pull back from the specific geography of the strait, from the specific wreckage of the specific vessel, and look at the global power architecture that the Hormuz engagement has just restructured. Because the implications of tonight's events extend to every corner of the international system simultaneously, and in ways whose full dimensions will take years to trace, but whose direction is already unmistakable. The post-war international order was built on a specific military technological foundation, the demonstrated capacity of American naval power to project force into any ocean on the planet and to prevail against any regional challenger in the process. This capacity was not merely a military fact. It was the organizing logic of a global system. The reason that American security commitments were credible, that American diplomatic positions carried weight, that American economic frameworks could be imposed and maintained, and that the dollar-denominated financial architecture underpinning global trade could function as the universal medium of exchange. Remove the military foundation and the entire superstructure built on it becomes subject to renegotiation. China is the actor whose position has been most dramatically improved by the Hormuz engagement without any Chinese action. Beijing has spent years constructing a position in the Middle East through economic investment, through the Saudi-Iranian normalization it mediated, through the expansion of its energy security relationships across the Gulf states, positioning itself as the indispensable economic partner for a region that American military dominance had historically kept at arm's length from Chinese strategic influence. The operational demonstration that American military power cannot protect Gulf energy infrastructure from Iranian action removes the primary strategic argument for Gulf state alignment with Washington over Beijing. Russia's position has been strengthened through mechanisms that operate automatically from the current crisis. Energy prices at historic highs generate revenues that finance Russian strategic capability across every domain. American strategic attention absorbed by the Gulf crisis reduces the bandwidth available for managing Russian interests in other theaters. The global South, the majority of humanity, the majority of the world's governments, is absorbing the Hormuz engagement through a lens that Western strategic communication is not equipped to address. The visible operational fact of an American carrier destroyed by a non-Western power using indigenously developed weapons communicates something to populations that have experienced the consequences of American military power from the receiving end. It communicates that the equation is not permanently fixed in the direction that 4 decades of American dominance suggested. The energy and economic consequences of the Hormuz engagement are already transmitting through the global system at the speed of financial markets. Oil prices at levels that trigger inflation, shocks across every energy importing economy, shipping insurance suspensions that extend the effective closure of the strait beyond the immediate Iranian action, supply chain disruptions that cascade through the industrial systems of the world's largest economies with a speed that no policy response can match in the short term. What is emerging from the burning wreckage of the USS Eisenhower is a world whose organizational logic must be renegotiated from foundations that no longer include the premise of unchallengeable American maritime dominance. The carriers will continue to be built. The flags will continue to be flown. The commitments will continue to be made. But the strategic proposition that a carrier's presence resolves questions of regional military dominance before a shot is fired, that proposition has been operationally retired in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz, and no subsequent political or military development will restore it to the status it held at dawn today. The vessel that carried on its hull the name of a supreme Allied commander who directed the liberation of a continent, and the name of a presidency that constructed the international order that followed that liberation, has ceased to exist as a surface combatant. It is on the floor of the Strait of Hormuz. The men and women who served aboard it, who trained for years for precisely the kind of engagement that unfolded tonight, whose professionalism and courage in the final minutes were never in question. They deserve to have the full weight of what their loss represents, stated plainly and without the cushioning language that institutional grief tends to reach for. This was not a system failure in the narrow bureaucratic sense of that phrase. What happened tonight was the successful execution of a strategic concept that Iran has been developing, refining, testing, and preparing to implement for the better part of 4 decades. The Noor missile is not a miracle weapon. It is the product of a disciplined, multi-generational investment in asymmetric capability, in weapons, in doctrine, in operational architecture, in the specific and patient study of how a technologically superior adversary actually operates in real combat conditions as opposed to how it operates in the threat assessments and exercise scenarios that defense establishments tend to confuse with operational reality. 300 Noor missiles, that is the number. Not a fleet of carriers, not a global network of bases, not a defense budget measured in the hundreds of billions. 300 missiles, a coastal launch architecture that survived every attempt to degrade it, and the operational patience to wait for the moment when the geometry of the engagement favored the attacker rather than the defender. The exchange ratio of what happened tonight measured in dollars, in strategic effect, in the symbolic weight of what was lost versus what was expended to achieve that loss, represents a data point that every defense ministry on earth is processing right now with the focused attention that only genuine strategic surprise can generate. The Strait of Hormuz will eventually be navigated again. American carriers will eventually return to the region because the logic of American strategic commitments and the domestic political economy of American military power make withdrawal from the Persian Gulf a scenario that no administration can implement quickly, regardless of what any individual within that administration believes about the wisdom of continued forward presence. The world those carriers return to, however, will not be the world that existed when the Eisenhower transited the strait this morning with the full operational confidence that its presence was supposed to project. The strategic equations have been rewritten in a way that cannot be erased by a press conference, a carrier deployment, or a congressional authorization. The governing logic of the regional order, the logic that held that American naval supremacy in the Persian Gulf was a structural feature of the international system rather than a contingent military posture subject to revision by a sufficiently capable and sufficiently motivated adversary, has been permanently revised. The revision was not accomplished through diplomacy, through economic leverage, or through the kind of negotiated realignment that leaves all parties with a face saving narrative. It was accomplished through the operational execution of a weapon system whose name in the language of the civilization that built it means light. Civilizations name their weapons after the things they believe they are defending, or the things they believe they are bringing into the world. Iran named this one after illumination. What the destruction of an American aircraft carrier means for the next decade of global power competition is a question that does not have a clean answer tonight and will not have one for years. The deterrence frameworks that govern great power behavior in the Persian Gulf rested on assumptions that this engagement has exposed as structurally insufficient, not theoretically questionable, not subject to academic debate, but operationally, demonstrably, concretely insufficient in the most unambiguous way that military reality provides. The Noor missiles have done their work. The light they cast is permanent. The fires burning on the surface of the Persian Gulf tonight are visible from orbit. The analysis continues. Stay with Warscope Analysis.